Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're navigating something we all face eventually, grief. Now,
Mm.
you've probably seen a lot of advice out there, right? Stuff
Mhm.
focused on getting over loss, reducing pain, moving on. But the material we've been looking at, it offers a really different take, and I think maybe a more helpful one.
Exactly. We've been spending time with some sources, um, parts of PDF and an article from refugeandgrief.com.
Mm.
And what really stands out is how they focus on living with the loss,
Hmm.
not trying to just escape it.
Yeah, and that's really our mission for this deep dive to properly get at this key difference between the actual pain of grief, which is, let's face it, totally natural,
Hmm.
and the suffering that can kind of pile on top of that pain. We want to pull out some practical ways for you to maybe reduce that suffering, but still honor the realness of the loss.
Hmm.
Because the core idea here is like pain is just part of it, but suffering that often comes from outside pressure or, our own internal struggles.
It's really striking, isn't it, how much the sources push back against this common societal thing of trying to fix grief.
Mhm.
Like it's a problem to be solved. We're always being told, move on, get through it.
It's so true. And the material, it captures that frustration so well. It points out all that well-meaning, maybe, but often just deeply unhelpful advice. The it'll get better or be grateful for what you had, or even that really kind of absurd idea that you'll just find someone else, replace them.
Well, yeah.
And that internal reaction the author mentions, that sort of sarcastic, great, bring it on, thanks so much. That really lands, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And if you think about it, those kinds of comments, even when they are meant kindly,
Mm.
they can feel just incredibly invalidating. When you're in that deep grief, being pushed to like look on the bright side or feeling shamed almost for not being further along, it's just isolating.
It just grates. Yeah, early grief is so raw, and those little encouragements, they can feel like they're minimizing what you're actually going through. So it makes you think, okay, if we're not supposed to just get over it, what's the alternative then?
Well, that's a really important question, isn't it?
Yeah.
What happens if that pain isn't allowed, isn't acknowledged?
Yeah.
The sources touch on this, and it does bring to mind, people like Bessel van der Kolk talking about how the body keeps the score, how unexpressed pain finds other ways out.
Right. So the basic message seems to be grief pain is valid, full stop. It's not something
Mhm.
you can just wish away or fix. And the sources really contrast that urge to erase the pain with something much gentler. They talk about tending to it with uh, kind, compassionate, simple honesty and care.
And that leads us right into this really central point,
Yeah.
understanding that difference between pain and suffering and grief.
Yeah.
The sources define pain as like the pure, healthy, completely normal reaction to losing someone or something important. It's just the natural result of love,
Yeah.
of connection.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit more. Because then they define suffering as what happens when that pain gets dismissed, maybe. Or it doesn't get support. Or it's that internal battle, right? Questioning yourself, feeling like you're doing grief wrong, replaying things over and over with self-blame.
Exactly that. Suffering often kicks in when you're told, maybe directly or indirectly, that what you're feeling is wrong, or that you should be feeling something else entirely.
And it's not just internal, though, is it? The sources point to outside things, too. Like unhelpful comments are huge, obviously. But also just not looking after yourself, sleep, food, or being around people who just drain you.
Yeah, or pretending the pain isn't there, that definitely fuels suffering. And that endless loop of rehashing events and blaming yourself, that's a big one.
Mm-hmm.
There's another angle the text brings in, the connection some make to Buddhist ideas. This notion that, well, suffering is kind of part of life and the goal isn't to avoid pain, but maybe to learn how to respond to it differently, with openness, maybe accepting impermanence.
Right, but it's important to clarify, and the sources do this too. It's not about pretending there's no pain. It's not about like detaching from everything.
No, not at all. It's more about finding ways, practices, tools, whatever works for you, that help you withstand the pain, to lessen the suffering part, not to magically erase all pain and achieve some kind of constant happiness.
Which, let's be honest, feels pretty unrealistic when you're dealing with a major loss.
Totally unrealistic.
Okay, so if we can't just fix it, and the aim is more about reducing suffering while, letting the pain be there, what can we actually do? The sources bring up this really interesting idea. They call it the Great Grief Experiment, a really personal approach.
Yes, and I love that word, experiment. It takes the pressure off, doesn't it? It's not about passing or failing grief test. It's about discovery. Because, as they stress, every grief is unique. It's as individual as the relationship you lost.
Right. So it's about finding what helps you specifically navigate this loss. Kind of figuring out, okay, what's the raw pain that just needs care and what's the extra suffering that maybe, just maybe, I can adjust somehow.
Exactly. It's all about self-inquiry, trying things out, seeing what actually lands for you.
And the goal isn't necessarily feeling okay all of a sudden. It's often way more subtle. Finding things that make the day feel, I don't know, just a little easier or maybe gentler, even amidst the really intense pain.
Like finding a specific piece of music or even just 5 minutes outside. Those small things can be surprisingly helpful.
So the first practical step then in this experiment is what they call gathering data. Basically becoming really aware of your own grief, paying attention to even tiny shifts in how you feel, what's happening around you.
And what's really insightful there is the idea that even those big waves of grief, the moments where you feel totally overwhelmed, often have little warning signs beforehand. It's rarely just out of the blue.
Exactly. To give an example, like noticing you're getting really irritable. That might seem small, but it could be a signal that, your basic needs aren't being met. Rest, food, less stress, making you more vulnerable.
Yeah. And that analogy they use, the stability bank account, that's quite useful.
Yeah.
Thinking of interactions, stressors, as withdrawals. If you notice your balance is getting low, maybe you can do something before you completely crash.
But it's not just about the withdrawals, is it? It's also noticing what adds to that account, what deposits energy, which people, places, activities give you even a tiny bit of relief or peace.
Right. And the sources suggest asking yourself some pretty direct questions like, how do you really feel after seeing certain people? Are there times a day that feel a bit calmer? What about books or movies or specific places you any offer even a little temporary escape?
They give a great example, log entry. Someone noticing they felt awful in a crowded grocery store. Maybe too many memories. But then feeling surprisingly okay doing practical stuff at a party, like helping out, but not really engaging deeply. And noticing, okay, my mother-in-law supports me when we talk logistics for the memorial, but not really otherwise. And finding some calm just being near the ocean.
And the key takeaway from just starting to notice this stuff, especially early on, is that the goal is often just finding moments that feel less bad.
Hmm.
It's not about chasing happiness right now. It's about finding those little pockets of relative calm.
And this data gathering, it's really fundamental, isn't it? To start seeing your own personal distinction between the unavoidable pain of the loss and what they call arbitrary suffering, the extra stuff that isn't directly the grief itself, but comes from, self-criticism or expectations or whatever. It starts to show you where you might actually have a little bit of control, maybe.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And once you start collecting that data, that information about your own experience, you can begin to look for broader patterns, indicators that suggest, okay, I'm in a state of higher suffering right now, versus signs that maybe point towards a relative sense of calm, even with the pain.
Right. The sources give some useful lists here, kind of general indicators. For evidence of suffering, they mention things like, well, obvious stuff like bad sleep, appetite changes, nightmares. But also intrusive thoughts, feeling really anxious, blaming yourself a lot, even physical things like finding it hard to breathe.
Yeah, and on the flip side, evidence of relative calm might look like maybe your emotions feel a bit more even, not wild swings, perhaps being a bit kinder to yourself, feeling some connection or support, feeling rested, eating okay, just accepting your emotions, whatever they are, maybe being able to handle small stresses without totally falling apart.
And they really encourage you, the listener, to make your own lists. What does it look like for you when suffering is high? And what are the signs for you that you're managing to navigate the pain with a bit more gentleness? It's so personal.
Another really big contributor to suffering, which the sources highlight, is that negative self-talk. That inner critic can just go into overdrive during grief.
Oh, absolutely. They use the word ravenous to describe how the mind can get during stress, especially if you're someone who tends to analyze things, maybe blame yourself easily.
That constant urge to replay events, second guess everything. What did I miss? Why didn't I do X, Y, or Z?
And that's where this idea of wellness thoughts versus worseness thoughts comes in, right? Worseness thoughts are the ones that just pile on more stress, more suffering, often stuck in the past, what if only, or catastrophizing the future, how can I possibly live?
Exactly. And those thoughts, they just drain you. They don't help. They just create more suffering. Whereas wellness thoughts or images or memories, those are the things that might bring just a moment of grounding, a little bit of peace. And interestingly, they suggest that these can actually increase your capacity to bear the underlying pain.
So the suggestion is actually to compare them. Like, make a list for yourself, your personal wellness thoughts, ideas, images, even activities, and compare them to your worstness ones, including maybe coping habits that feel okay short term but actually make things worse later.
Yes, exactly that. And the key insight is you know this stuff already, deep down. You know when a thought feels grounding versus when it just sends you spiraling. You know when you feel connected to your core, even pain.
Right.
So writing these down when you're feeling a bit calmer can be really useful. It gives you something to look at when you're overwhelmed. A reminder to consciously try and steer towards things that feel a bit more gentle.
Okay, so bringing it all together, how does this process, gathering data, noticing thoughts, actually help us navigate day to day?
Well, the sources argue that it gives you leverage. By starting to see the difference between the raw pain and the added suffering, and by noticing how certain activities or thoughts affect you, you begin to identify the aspects you can potentially influence.
And this leads to that really empowering idea they mentioned, building your own personal compass, inspired by, I think, Martha Beck's North Star idea, but made from your data, your understanding of what ramps up suffering for you and what brings even small moments of calm.
Exactly. And that compass becomes like a starting point when you feel completely lost and overwhelmed by the grief. It gives you concrete personal ideas for self-care, self-help. So if your data shows that, say, poor sleep is a big suffering trigger for you, and reducing sugar or screen time at night seems to help you, well, that's a direction your compass points.
Or if spending time with a certain friend consistently leaves you feeling judged and angry, your compass might suggest, maybe gently, creating a bit more distance there for a while.
Right. And the sources are realistic. They acknowledge this might sound like a ridiculous cerebral exercise when you're just trying to survive the day.
Yeah, I can see that.
But the point is, you don't have to just float adrift in this huge pain without any tools, without any self-understanding. Becoming a curious, kind observer of your own experience is actually a way to regain a little bit of agency.
A little bit of understanding in the chaos?
Precisely. And it's so important to repeat. These lists, this compass, they aren't magic fixes. They won't make the pain disappear. But they can offer orientation, a direction, maybe just a tiny bit of help as you find your way through.
So the ultimate goal then, it seems, is finding some measure of inner peace, reducing that extra suffering layer, learning to tend to the actual pain with kindness, and being able to, as they say, hold the gaze on what's broken without being totally drowned by suffering about it.
And as you keep gathering this data, just noticing, patterns will emerge. You'll start to see, without judging yourself, what genuinely feels a bit better for you and what consistently feels worse.
And that final thought they offer is really powerful too, that even when you have absolutely no energy, just turning your attention, even slightly, towards wellness, towards gentleness, that itself is a valid and important step.
Every little bit counts. So, just to quickly recap our deep dive today, we've really dug into that vital difference between pain and suffering and grief. We talked about why trying to just get rid of the pain often backfires. And we explored this idea of grief as a personal experiment, using self-awareness and data gathering to spot your unique suffering triggers and find those small sources of relative calm.
Yeah, and remembering throughout that it's your grief, your journey, and being kind to yourself in that process is maybe the most important thing.
Absolutely. So maybe a final thought to leave you with. Now that you've heard about this framework, pain versus suffering, the grief experiment, what's one small act of self-awareness maybe?
Yeah.
Or just gentle exploration? What's one tiny thing you might consider trying or just noticing in the coming days, looking through this particular lens, something to maybe reflect on?